Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Zayin, Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Tzvedlana, Aranbai, Menuchato Began Eden, Amen. Rabotai, in yesterday's Mishnah we learned that plants with Shemitah sanctity require bi'ur if they do not last in the ground. Today's Mishnah deals with items that do last in the ground, and therefore, even though they have Shemitah sanctity, they are not subject to bi'ur. V'od klal acher amru, the sages said another rule. Kol shehu ma'achal adam u'ma'achal behema u'mimin hatzovim, any produce that is food for people, or food for animals, or a species used for dying, u'mitkem ba'aretz, and it lasts in the ground, which we said it means it remains viable through the 8th year. Yesh lo shviit u'damav shviit, it has Shemitah sanctity, and the money that you receive for it has Shemitah sanctity. En lo biur ven adamav biur. However, it is not subject to the laws of biur, and the money received for it is not subject to the laws of biur. Eizehu, which types of produce are example for these things? Ikar aluf hashoteh, the category of plants used for human food that lasts in the ground includes Ikar aluf hashoteh, the root of the wild loof, meaning even though in yesterday's Mishnah we learned that the leaves of the wild loof do not last in the ground and therefore they're subject to the laws of bi'ur, this Mishnah is telling us the roots do survive in the ground and therefore they do not require bi'ur. V'ikara dandana, the root of the mint, v'ha'alkabanin, alkabanin is a grass that grows near the base of a palm tree and it curls itself around them. V'ha'chalbitzin, roots of the milky blossom, which are the roots of the plant we said yesterday, the netzach chalav, right? So the roots of the milky blossom, the bukhria, and bukhria the Rav defines it as an Arabic plant. I don't know what it is. So the art school today brings down the Musaf He'aruch describes it as a herb whose root has a pleasant cinnamon-like aroma. Umimin atzovim apua v'arichpa, and the category of species used for dyeing that last in the ground include madder and dyer's weed. Yesh lahem shviit v'lidmen shviit. All these products have Shemitah sanctity, and the money received for them have Shemitah sanctity. En lahem biur v'lo lidmen biur. However, they are not subject to the laws, to the requirement of biur, and the money received for them also is not subject to the requirement of biur. The reason the Mishnah repeats, as we literally just said it, is because it wants to introduce Rabbi Meir's ruling that he disagrees. Rabbi Meir says, D'mehem mit ba'arin ad Rosh Hashanah. Even though the plants themselves do not require bi'ur, the money that you received for them must be consumed, meaning spent on food before Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, meaning the end of Shemitah, right? Before the end of Shemitah. Rabbi Meir says that the money has to be disposed of before Rosh Hashanah because if it's left around any longer, a person might forget that it has Shemitah sanctity and use it for business purposes. Now, the Mifashim explain that the money has to be spent in accordance with the laws of Shemitah before the end of the year. Once Rosh Hashanah is passed, according to Rabbi Meir, you have to destroy it as soon as possible to prevent people from using it unlawfully for business purposes. Amrula, but the Chachamim answered him, Lahen and biur. 1 second. These plants themselves do not require biur. Kal v'chol litme'en, how much more so for the money they receive for them? It's illogical to treat the money, the exchange money, whose Shemitah sanctity comes from the original Shemitah produce, more strictly than the produce itself. Therefore, since the Shemitah produce itself has no biur, and certainly does not have to be destroyed, the money exchanged for it does not need to be destroyed either. Meaning, the Mefarshim explain, the Chachamim agree that Rabbi Meir's concern about accidentally using the money for business is valid. There is a concern, but we cannot be more stringent with the money than with the produce itself. Whereas Rabbi Meir argues that the money should be treated more strictly than the produce. Why? Because since the money looks like the same like any other money, the owner might forget that it's sacred and use it for business. The produce, however, is recognizable that it belongs to Shemitah, and therefore the owner would not use it improperly. But at any rate, the Rav tells us, En Archa ke Rabbi Meir, the Halakha does not follow Rabbi Meir. Rather, just like the produce has no requirement of biur, the money has no requirement of biur as well. That is Rabotai Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel gives us more examples of plants that have Shemitah sanctity. Klipe rimon, the peel of a pomegranate. Ve'anet shelo, and its blossom, meaning the Rav explains the greenish the greenish growth at the top of the fruit that is encircled by the crown of the pomegranate. Klipe egozim, the husks of the walnut, which the Mefarshim explain, not the hard shell that has the nut, but the husk that encloses the shell as it grows on the tree, which are all usable as dyes. The agal inin, and fruit pits that are eaten by people or animals, like olive pits, which are used to produce oil, or date pits, which are used as animal food. Yesh lahem shviit v'litmen shviit. Right, they have Shemitah sanctity, and the money you receive for them has Shemitah sanctity. And therefore they also require, the Tosfot Yom Tov says, they require, not therefore, but they require bi'ul. Now, even though the actual flesh of pomegranates, walnuts, olives, and dates already have Shemitah sanctity, their peels and pits would not have Shemitah sanctity unless they were edible or they were used in dyeing, which is why the Mishnah had to say this. Now, the Mishnah is going to introduce to us the issur against doing business with Shemitah produce as well as with other certain items, right? As a background, you're not allowed to conduct business with Shemitah produce because the Torah says, Vayta shavat haaretz lachem leochla. The uncultivated produce of the land shall be for you to eat, which the Chachamim learned from, that Shemitah produce can only be used for eating and related purposes, but not for making a profit. Now, the actual selling of the Shemitah produce is not asur unless a person does it to make a profit. Why? Because the Torah prohibits business activities, which is generally buying an item in order to resell it at a higher price. Therefore, the Mishnah is teaching that the Mishnah is going to say right now, Hatzabat tzoveh la'atzmo. A dyer may use Shemitah produce to dye fabrics for himself, v'lo yitzba b'sachar, but he cannot dye fabrics for others for payment, right? Because payment is considered a business activity, the Mishnah does not allow you to use Shemitah produce for payment, because you're going to get paid for it. She'en osin schora beperot Sheviit, because we cannot do business with Shemitah produce, and using the dye to make money is considered a business activity. V'lo b'bechorot, we cannot do business with blemished firstborn animals. What does that mean? The Torah says in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 18, Psukim 15 to 18, that somebody who has a firstborn male cattle and sheep or goat must give it to the Kohen, right? Cattle, sheep, or goat, firstborn male has to be given to the Kohen. The Kohen brings the animal, which is called a bechor, a firstborn, as a korban in the Bet HaMikdash. Only the Kohanim or members of their families can eat the meat. If the animal has a blemish, a mum, that disqualifies it from being offered as a korban in the Bet HaMikdash, it still has to be given to the Kohen, but he doesn't bring it as an offering. Instead, he eats it wherever he wants, he lets someone else eat it, or he sells it. However, there are still certain restrictions. You cannot work it and you cannot shear its wool. Now, even though the Kohen can sell a blemished bechor, the Chachamim prohibited doing business with it, like buying a bechor in order to resell it at a higher price. Why? Because if a market would exist for blemished firstborn animals, the Kohanim would delay slaughtering them in order to sell them, and that delay could possibly result in people violating the isurim against working or shearing these animals' wool. V'lo batrumot, you cannot do business with tiruma. Now we know tiruma is the portion of the produce in Eretz Yisrael that is set aside and given to a Kohen, right? It is forbidden to give a non-Kohen tiruma to eat. So the Chachamim prohibited doing business with tiruma because if it would be stored like merchandise, there's a concern that it might be eaten by a non-Kohen. The Mishnah continues, V'lo b'nevelot, you cannot do business with nevelot. Nevelot is any dead animal, right? Except a kosher animal that was slaughtered in the required way, right? V'lo b'trefot, you cannot do business with trefot. Trefot is an animal that has certain defects, types of wounds or defects that would cause it to die in the near future, right? So the Torah says even if you slaughter it properly, you cannot eat it. And the Rav explains to us, right? The biblical law, Torah, forbids using these items, selling these items. And the Rav says, the Torah says, they will be impure for you. 1 second. If you already said it's impure, what's the for you? Rather, the Chachamim learn out, one is for the issur of eating and one is for the issur of doing business with it. Now, if you're going to ask donkeys, camels, horses, mules, we use them. So the Rav says those are different. Why? Because they're grown for working. The prohibition to do business applies with something that is meant for food. Anything that is biblically asur, you are not allowed to do business with it. However, anything that's only rabbinical asur, you could do business with it, except for stam yanam. Stam yanam is when the general wine of a non-Jew, that you cannot do business with, even though it's the Rabbanan, for a specific reason that the Chachamim give, right? Now, the Torah says explicitly that you can sell nevilah to a non-Jew in Sefer Dvarim. So we see that the Isur D'Oraita is only to do business activities, like buying the item and selling it for a profit. Selling something that you happen to have is not included in the prohibition. Now, the Mishnah continues, right? Lo benevelot, lo betrefot, lo beshikatzim. What's shikatzim? Shikatzim includes non-kosher fish and other aquatic creatures like seahorses, frogs. It includes non-kosher birds and other flying creatures like flies, mosquitoes, bees, land-based venom of various kinds like snakes or scorpions. You cannot do business with these. Velo beremasim, now with remasim. Remasim are tiny worms and insects that grow inside of fruit or rotting matter. You cannot do business with any of these items. This itself is a biblical isur. The Tosfot Yom Tov says doing business with something that's asur from the Torah is a biblical isur. The Tosfot Yom Tov writes. The Mishnah continues to Shemitah. Velo yeh lokeach yalkot sadeh umocher bashuk. A person cannot pick vegetables of the field in order to sell them and then sell them in the market, because that is the appearance of a business activity. But he can pick the vegetables and his son will sell them instead of him. Why? Because since he is not selling them himself, he does not give the impression that he's engaging in a business activity. The Mefarshim explain that the Torah prohibits buying Shemitah produce in order to resell it at a profit. Midrabanan, the rabbis came and said you cannot pick produce for the purpose of selling it, because when you do it, it resembles a business activity. So therefore the Chachamim said that you cannot do this. However, it only applies when the person picking the produce himself sells it himself. But if anybody else, even the picker's son, sells it, there is no isur, because now it does not have an appearance of doing business, right? Even when you sell the Shemitah produce, by the way, even in a case where it would be allowed, and we're going to learn that in the Mishnayot, the money that you receive it is also considered sacred, right? The Mishnah continues, Lakach le'atzmo ve'otir. Let's say somebody picked Shemitah produce for the purpose of eating it himself, and some was left over. Mutar le'mochan, you are allowed to sell it. Why? In this case, you can sell it even yourself, because since you picked it in order to eat it, selling whatever remains doesn't give off the impression of a business. It doesn't resemble a business activity. That is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen. Amen.